Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you're doing well. In today's video, I will be repairing an old Ender 3 3D printer that has been sitting around my basement for quite a few months now. It is a printer that I inherited from my brother, and it is quite old and broken, and it kind of feels like Cherno Alpha from the Pacific Rim movies. But unfortunately, one of the connectors on the back shorted out and almost burned my house down. So I think it's high time that I get this venerated machine back up and printing again, so it may live on, printing me some terrain at an albeit slower pace than my newer and fancier machine. So I have bought myself here today some replacement connectors, some solder, of course, a soldering iron with a big old thick tip. It's like a soldering slash wood burning kit, so I think this is one of the wood burning tips, but like it really doesn't matter. As well as some shrink wraps and a kit for 3D printing containing a knife, some snips, and a whole bunch of other goodies that I found useful along this project here. And for anyone expecting a masterwork from this, I will warn you, I have never soldered before. So feel free to tell me how dog shit I am at soldering in the comments if you like, but don't go on expecting anything crazy or fancy. It is functional at best. And for anyone actually expecting any wargaming here, this is just the repair, but there is another video releasing in tandem with this one where I actually print off some very fancy terrain that was designed by my brother. So STLs will be included, and you can see how I build my stuff there. Anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the video.
The first step to repairing this most holy and blessed of machines was to cleanse its flesh of the burnt and cancerous connectors that clings to its flesh.
Sorry, I'll lay off the tech priest. Anyway, as I was saying, I cut off the burnt out connector as close as I possibly can to it in order to save as much length of the wire. And then, because I lack any bona fide wire strippers, I'm just using my hobby knife to cut off the insulation to expose some of that nice shiny metal underneath. After I had myself a nice pile of brittle and crusty-ass insulation fragments, I sweep that all off and throw it in the trash. And the next step was to prepare my shrink wraps by sliding them up and over the wires out of the way of the actual soldering surface. Now, thankfully I had the foresight to do this, so I wouldn't have to disassemble my freshly made soldering later, but sadly I did pick some shrink wraps that were a bit too small, and I definitely had to force them, but it all worked out in the end. But I'll know for next time. I then repeated the same stripping process on the connector wires there. And I was doing all of this under the tutelage of my brother, who has a electronics engineering diploma, and he told me that these wires came pre-tinned, which is apparently a good thing, not that I'd know, but I still elected to give myself a little bit more of a working surface on them because the ends that were stripped were not that stripped. It was only about like a millimeter of actual working space. Alright, now I'm not gonna lie to you, at this point I was riding pretty high. I was like, thinking I was like John Solder over here. But my brother, who has an electronics engineering diploma, told me that soldering was difficult. And I kind of brushed him off and was like, yeah, right, dude, soldering ain't shit. And I was mostly joking, but I also thought this was gonna be a lot easier than it turned out to be. So, getting into the meat and potatoes of this soldering video, I prep my wires and my iron using the cutting mat from the printing kit in order to avoid dripping hot lead onto the table, because God knows that if I did that, my mother would slaughter me. So I knew it before, but I know it especially now that it is very important to have your wires properly braced, because for this first weld here, I braced the soldering iron and then just loosey-goosey held my wires above that and soldered it that way, and while it worked, it wasn't the most stable thing, but surprisingly this first weld went pretty well and pretty quick, which definitely helped contribute to my delusions that soldering ain't shit. It was at this point where I tried to fit the shrink wrap for the positive terminal over the weld, and I realized that wow, my weld was way too fat and this shrink wrap was way too small. So I ended up exchanging them all for a size up, but unfortunately there was not a red shrink wrap that was bigger, so I ended up just using a yellow on the other positive terminal. After the shrink wraps were installed and the first terminal had completely fused, it was time to send it on the negative one. And as you can see by how sped up this footage is and how many times the wire just falls off, this one did not go quite as smoothly, but in the end I managed to get it together. And in case you are worried by seeing how much smoke is releasing from the weld, fear not, this is not actually vaporized lead as I originally suspected. It is actually just the flux, which is a layer of material in the center of the solder, that just prevents metal oxides from being formed, because apparently metal oxides prevent the fusion process from happening properly. Woohoo, there we go, all 4 wires have been welded together. I neglected to show what happened on the other terminal because, quite frankly, the footage was bad and it was a very embarrassingly long process, so just take my word for it, everything went well. Anyway, now it's time to properly deal with these shrink wraps, and this is honestly my favorite part because these shrink wraps are just very fun and satisfying to work with and watch. Anyway, using a heat gun, I just blast these little suckers until they conform to the wire. And honestly, the end result is quite comical, because it's just this otherwise smooth wire juxtaposed against this hideous bulge of lead and wire bits just sticking out from the middle. I hope it works, but at this point, I was like, ooh, that is ugly. Alrighty folks, now we ask the $1,000,000 question. Will it burn my house down? No, it will not, which is very nice because I like my house. Now it's time to go about the process of remembering how one of these things work, because this thing does not have the newfangled fancy auto leveling or any of the bells and whistles that my new FDM printer has. So, starting out, I have to auto-home it, which is a funny process on these things, because if you try to auto-home it with the extruder in the wrong corner, it'll just stay in that corner and then make a weird crunchy noise, so you have to manually move it to the corner that it likes to auto-home in. And then, instead of having an auto-leveling system, you've got to manually turn 4 cranks at each corner of the build plate, which is a process, but I gotta say, it's nice to have another FDM printer. You'll find that my manufacturing capacity has doubled since we last met.
Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
All systems nominal indeed. As an inaugural print for this newly refurbished printer, I decided to print off the classic Benchy Boat test print. Let it serve as a reminder that any 3D printer can be brought back from the brink with the proper application of holy oils, the burning of sacred incense, and the recitement of the proper canticles, as in accordance with the cult Mechanicus. Anyway, this has been Semi-Historical Wargaming. Thank you so much for tuning in, have a lovely day, and I hope you enjoyed the video.
The machine is my temple, each one a sacred shrine. I name each piston blessed, and every gear divine.